without the digestive system, it's not really going to be able to function. So is the digestive system the most important system? Well, the intestines would argue probably yes. Now, when we're looking at the digestive system, I apologize I didn't include in the notes that you have there the learning objectives or the learning objectives for the previous units. I've posted those separately now so you can see what those learning objectives are going forward. I'll obviously include them. I don't know why they're not here, but you have them now. They're posted in that folder. What we are going to be talking about is the different structures associated with the digestive system, that alimentary canal, all of the parts along the way that are going to be coming into contact with the food, as well as the accessory structures, the accessory glands, importantly the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder that are associated with digestion. And then we're going to talk a lot about the digestive physiology. So how does this digestion actually work? What are the different things that you're able to control? And it turns out that the only two things that you are able to change when it comes to, or regulate when it comes to the digestive system, are motility, which is the movement, so how much contraction is happening in the walls of these digestive structures. So the motility is one thing that you can change, increasing it or decreasing it. And the other thing that you can change or control, regulate, is the amount of secretion that happens. So how much fluid is being released into your mouth by your salivary glands, or into your stomach by the wall of your stomach, or into your intestines, your intestinal juice, from your pancreas moving into the intestines. So how much fluid is able to be produced and then secreted into these organs and tissues. That's it. That is the only two things that you're able to regulate. And you don't even get to do this voluntarily. You don't decide how much saliva you're going to make. As we're going to see today, it can be almost 1.5 liters a day. You don't get to decide how much gastric juice you produce. It could be up to 1 liter a day. You don't decide how much pancreatic juice that you produce. It could be 1.5 liters a day. All of a sudden, we're talking liters and liters and liters of fluid that's being released into your digestive system. Now, if all of that fluid stays in your digestive system, where is it going to come out? The other end. No one wants to say anus? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so it's going to eventually come out. So obviously, we don't all have diarrhea all the time from all of this fluid that we're releasing, so we're going to be reabsorbing a lot of it back. So yes, we produce it, we secrete it, but then we're going to get it back. We're going to reabsorb it back into our bloodstream. So those are the two things that we can control. So as we go along, we're going to talk about this idea of motility and secretion. How is it that we're able to have this contraction and relaxation? And then how are we able to produce all of these different types of fluids to be able to have that secretion take place? All right, so let's talk now about digestion. When we look at digestion, there's really two different types of digestion that we have. One of them is one that is a little bit more obvious and one that we kind of think about often when we imagine digestion. But there is a second one. That second one is mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion is all about the churning and the mixing and the grinding that's going to be taking place of the food that you're eating. Give me an example of mechanical digestion. Chewing, right? That's nice little bagels or whatever you're eating. Absolutely. So when you chew your food, that's mechanical digestion. When you're grinding up your food or churning your food in your stomach, mixing it around with all the secretions in your stomach, that's mechanical digestion. What you are not doing in mechanical digestion is breaking chemical bonds. You're not talking about breaking proteins down into their building blocks. You're not talking about breaking starches down into carbohydrates. There's no enzymes that we're talking about here when it comes to mechanical digestion. It's just breaking big chunks of food down into smaller chunks of food. So if you imagine when you're chewing up your bagel, right? Well, at the end, when you've got this mush in your mouth, what have you got? Well, you've got mushed up bagel. It's still bagel, though. You haven't done anything chemically with it yet. Okay? All you've done is mixed it around, mushed it around, mashed it around. That's mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion is very important also because chemical digestion is now where we're going to take these larger macromolecules, so things like proteins, things like starches, carbohydrates, right? Things like fats, and we're going to break them down into their building blocks. Because these large macromolecules, proteins, they're too big for you to be able to absorb. Because the two major functions of the digestive system are, yes, digestion, but as we're going to see in a second, also absorption. Yes, you have to break down your food, but you also have to then get it into your bloodstream. And in order for you to be able to get these nutrients into your bloodstream, they have to be small, because we're going to be talking about diffusion for the most part that's going to allow for this absorption to take place. So in order to get now to these very small breakdown products, you're going to require some enzymes. You're going to have digestive enzymes, things like amylases and lipases and proteases. They all end in ASEs, so you know that they're proteins. And so they're enzymes. So you're going to be able to break these compounds down into their building blocks, into things like glucose, into things like amino acids, the building blocks of these larger macromolecules. And it's those end products of digestion, the end products of the chemical digestion, that you will then be able to absorb into your bloodstream, or as we'll see in a little bit next week, into your lymphatic system as well. Okay, so this is the second major function then of the digestive system. Both of them have to be working. You have to have both of these functioning properly, otherwise you're not going to be able to do the other job. Right? If you have absorption working just fine, but your enzymes aren't being secreted properly, you can't get your proteins broken down into amino acids, well then you're not going to be able to absorb anything because proteins are too big. You can't get them into the bloodstream. Okay? Similarly, if your digestion is working properly, so your enzymes are working very, very well, you've got the mechanical digestion working, that's great. But you're not able to absorb things because maybe you've got a whole bunch of damage to the lining of your intestines. Well, yeah, you have the end products of digestion, but you can't get them into your bloodstream, then that's going to be a problem. So you have to have both digestion and absorption working properly in order for the proper functioning of the digestive system. When we look at the structure of the gastrointestinal tract, or GI tract, we're going to see that it's the same 4 layers wherever we're talking about. So essentially, once you kind of get into the esophagus, which is where most of our conversation will start, we'll talk briefly about the oral cavity, but let's spend most of the time from the esophagus down. And once we get into the esophagus, we're going to see the same 4 layers that make up the wall of the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine. And so we're going to list them now. And then as we get into these different structures, like the stomach or the intestine, we'll see that in certain places there'll be some modifications to these 4 layers. Always the 4 layers will be there, but there might be some modifications to, for example, the number of muscle layers in this muscularis region. And we'll see that most of the time we're going to have 2 layers of smooth muscle. A longitudinal layer that runs along the length of the structure, and then a circumferential one that runs around the circumference of that structure, whether it's the intestines or the stomach or what have you. But then, maybe in the stomach, we'll use as the example, there's actually a 3rd layer, an oblique layer that kind of runs kind of in between. So we'll talk about some of those differences and those, if you want, modifications to the 4 layers as we go along. But in every case, we're going to have these same 4 basic layers. There's a mucosal layer, so this is going to be the innermost layer, the lining. This is a mucous membrane. Why is it going to be a mucous membrane? It's called mucosa, so it's telling you it's a mucous membrane, but why? Because it's a pathway connected to the outside. If you think about the inside of your stomach, it's actually on the outside of your body. If you think about the inside, the lumen of your intestines, that's on the outside of your body. Inside, the lumen of your large intestine, it's on the outside of your body, right? Because you haven't passed through a membrane. You can swallow that camera and it goes all the way down into your stomach. You haven't crossed across a membrane or punched your way through a wall or anything. You're still on the outside of the body. What was that thought experiment that nobody actually did in real life? The string, right? You swallow the string and hold on to one end of it. The rest of the string works its way down. You remember, oh yeah, that was really disgusting. That was like the first day that we met, way back in September, and we're doing these disgusting experiments. And then that string works its way all the way along until it comes out the other end, right? That string is still on the outside of your body. It hasn't passed through a membrane yet. Right? And so we're talking about a mucous membrane here because you're still on this pathway that is connected to the outside of the body. All right, then we have the submucosa. So again, mucous membrane, that's epithelial tissue. And so then we have to have, of course, some connective tissue associated with it, just deep to it, which is going to have all of our blood vessels, some of that connective tissue in there to keep that mucus layer alive and happy and healthy. So you can see the blood vessels that are associated with this submucosa, which is going to be our connective tissue layer. Then we have our muscularis layer, which, as I said, usually is going to be made up of 2 layers of smooth muscle. It is smooth muscle, so as we'll see when we get into talking about the esophagus, once you swallow your food, you now lose voluntary control. So you hand over that control to the autonomic nervous system and to that enteric nervous system that we mentioned last semester, that brain of the gut, all of the neurons that are going to be responsible for controlling the activity of the digestive system, and you don't get voluntary control back until the very last moment. The very last moment, way at the very, very end of this pathway, way down in the anal canal, that the last second, last couple of centimeters, that's where you get voluntary control back with this control of the external anal sphincter. And so we'll talk more about that later on. But in between, so all of those processes that are happening in between when you swallow and when you find a bathroom, that's going to be controlled by the autonomic nervous system and our enteric nervous system. So smooth muscle is going to be in this muscularis layer. And then we have the serosa. So this is our serous membrane, the serous coverings of a lot of these organs, the connective tissue, outer surface coating. All right, so let's take a look then, thinking about this serosa, the serous membrane. Hopefully you remember from last semester that we do have these 3 different types of serous membranes. Okay, where is one of them? Pericardium around the heart. Where's another? The pleura around the lungs. And where's the third? The peritoneum, which is going to be in the abdominal cavity, and of course is going to be surrounding and lining these closed cavities. In this case, it's the abdominal cavity. So we have the visceral peritoneum, which is going to cover many of our abdominal organs. What's the other layer of the peritoneum? It's the parietal peritoneum, and together these form our serous membrane. So this is our 2 layers. The visceral covers the organs, the parietal lines the cavities, and then in between those 2 layers, you've got the space which has our serous fluid. What does that serous fluid do for us? Reduces friction, so it allows for the movement to happen, especially the movement of the intestines and the stomach, because there's going to be lots of contraction and relaxation, lots of mechanical digestion that's going to be taking place there to allow the movement of these substances and food and whatnot all further along. And we don't want to have any friction being generated. And so again, by having that serous fluid in there, we're going to reduce that as much as we can. Now in some places, we're going to find that this peritoneum, these 2 layers of the peritoneum, are actually fused together. So there is no space, there is no peritoneal cavity in certain places, and where that happens, we call those peritoneal folds. Okay, so a peritoneal fold is where you take those 2 layers, the visceral and the parietal layer of the serous membrane, and rather than having a little bit of space in between, they're actually fused together. So it makes a bit of a thicker membrane and allows for a pathway for blood vessels to exist, for nerves to exist, lymphatic vessels to exist through these peritoneal folds. They're also going to allow for some structural support of our organs as well. So obviously we want to make sure that our intestines and our stomach stay where they're supposed to be in the abdominal cavity. If we didn't have some kind of structural support for them, where would they all be every time you stand up? Yeah, they would all fall down and end up kind of sitting on the floor of your abdominal cavity, all kind of in a big puddle or mass of intestinal movement happening at the floor of your abdominal cavity. But we don't want that. We want them to stay where they're supposed to be. And so in order to do that, we're going to have these peritoneal folds that help to anchor the intestines in place, that help to anchor the stomach in place, as well as provide a dedicated pathway for blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic vessels to be able to travel. We don't want, with all of the movement that's happening in the abdominal cavity, we don't want these blood vessels to get compressed too much. We don't want them to get compacted. And so we're able to kind of protect them and keep them safe inside these peritoneal folds so that movement is going on around them, but we can maintain blood flow and nerve function. So we're going to talk about 4 of these peritoneal folds. There's a couple of others, but we're not going to worry about those. These are the 4 major ones that we see. The first one, when we open up the abdominal cavity, a lot of times people think that as soon as you open up, slice through the skin, the abdominal cavity, and then remove those abdominal muscles, then you're going to see the intestines. That's actually not the case, because instead what we see is this big flap of adipose tissue. This is what we call the greater omentum. So the greater omentum, greater just means larger, it's the bigger, that means there's going to be a smaller one as well. But this greater omentum, this large kind of apron-like fold of peritoneum is going to be hanging down anterior to the intestines. So if you actually want to see the small intestines, you would have to fold this greater omentum up and out of the way. So the inferior edge is free floating, it's not attached. And so that means that it's only attached kind of at this superior angle here, this superior edge. And so you could grab on to that inferior edge and then fold it back up towards the person's head to be able to expose the intestines underneath. So again, we open up our cadaveric sample here. You can see there's the diaphragm. Right? So there's the diaphragm right there. What's this structure?
Yeah.
What is it?
The heart.
The heart. What's this? The lung. What's this here? That's our liver. And then, well, wait a minute, where are all the intestines? Well, they're all hidden deep to that greater omentum. So if you want to actually see them, then you have to grab onto this inferior edge, which is free floating, and then you can fold it back like they've done here, folded it back up towards the person's head, and then you're able to see all of the rest of those organs deep to it. There's a lot of adipose tissue associated with this greater omentum. That's why it has this yellow color associated with it. So when we talk about people having a beer belly or a beer gut, right, what is that? It's actually this greater omentum. So they're storing, this is an important storage place for adipose tissue. And so as people increase the amount of intake of calories and we're storing it away, a lot of it will get stored in this greater omentum. We do need some adipose tissue here. We don't want to get rid of all of it because it does act as an important insulator for our GI tract organs. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our body temperature appropriate in our intestines so that chemical digestion is able to take place and those enzymes can work very, very efficiently. And so we have adipose tissue there, and that's what we want. The issue then becomes if you're storing too much of that adipose tissue there, that can then impact health. But for the most part, we're going to see that lipid storage, that fat storage, helps to insulate our digestive organs. All right, so then we're going to fold that tissue back out of the way, and that then exposes the intestines deep to it. And so our next example of a peritoneal fold is going to be associated with our small intestines. So the peritoneal fold that is associated with our small intestines is the mesentery. So the mesentery, again, lots of connective tissue, acts as a pathway for blood vessels, and it's going to support the small intestine, helping to anchor the small intestine onto the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity and make sure that it kind of stays in place. It's flexible enough that it will allow for contraction and relaxation, so you can have the movement happening, but we don't want the intestines to get all coiled around. When you kind of jump up and down because you're excited because your final exams are just finished, right? Then you don't want all your intestines kind of just sloshing around inside your abdominal cavity. You want them, they can move, but you don't want them to get all twisted. Okay, so the mesentery is going to help to support the small intestines in that way. If any of you do dissections in high school, where you did like fetal pigs or cats or rats or some kind of, chicken? Did you say chicken?
No.
Oh.
I was looking at you like, okay, why the cat though?
Why the cat?
I know you
That
did
was
that.
great. Yeah, so I didn't get to do a cat, unfortunately.
Wow.
I did a rat. I did a pig. Yeah. So, those of you that did you ever have a competition to try to get the small intestine out in as long of a piece as you possibly could? Nobody? Yeah, one person, yeah, exactly. He's trying to stretch, keep out. And was it easy? Was it easy to get the intestine out in one piece without it tearing? It was kind of all a ball, right? And then in order to actually stretch it all out, you had to deal with this mesentery. In my class, the longest piece that someone was able to get out was, I don't know, probably about this long, right before it ripped, because the mesentery is there holding it. It's trying to keep it in its configuration where it's supposed to be, because that's the whole point of the mesentery, is to hold the intestines in place. It's this relatively dense connective tissue. Okay, I'll be careful there. It's irregular connective tissue, okay, dense, irregular connective tissue, but it's going to be very tough and trying to hold the intestines in place. You can see the outline of the intestine right here along the edge, and then all of this in the middle, that's the mesentery. So you can see the blood vessels that are going to be able to carry blood to and from the intestinal wall, and then all of this connective tissue to try to keep the intestines in place. So if you won that challenge of trying to get the intestines out in one long piece, congratulations. It's tough because of all of this mesentery. All right, the mesocolon is the third of these examples of peritoneal folds, and is essentially the same thing except for the large intestine. Okay, so it's essentially the same thing as this mesentery, except that it's the large intestine that we're talking about that holds this together. Okay. The final one is going, if you have a greater omentum, we're going to then have a lesser omentum. And so the lesser omentum is going to be the one that's located in this. You guys are mesentery. Okay, so we've got this lesser omentum that's going to be found in the lesser curvature of the stomach. So the superior kind of little curve right here of that stomach, that's where we find this lesser omentum. So you can imagine that the stomach is potentially going to contain quite a large weight of food. You eat that big plate of food and it all goes down into your stomach in a minute and a half because you're super hungry. What you don't want to have happen, of course, is the stomach to pull away from the inferior connection with the esophagus. As you jump up and down, you don't want the stomach to end up down on the floor of your pelvic cavity. You want it to stay where it's supposed to be. So to help hold it there, you've got this lesser omentum. We also find that the lesser omentum is the pathway through which a very important blood vessel travels. We mentioned this when we were talking about our vessels, and we saw that there was going to be a very important vein that travels through and is protected and supported by this lesser omentum. Not the gastric. The hepatic portal vein, exactly right. So the hepatic portal vein is going to be traveling part of its way through this lesser omentum on its way to the liver itself. Now, of course, in order to be able to see this lesser omentum in the rest of the stomach, you have to take the liver and fold it up out of the way. And that's what they've done in this drawing here. Quite challenging to do this in a real person, to actually just fold the liver out of the way. You probably just remove the liver. But there it is right there. This is the posterior surface of the liver because they folded it up and out of the way. Here you can see the lesser omentum itself, this connective tissue right here. This is a region of the liver there. There's some intestine here. And then, of course, this is this J-shaped sac, which is the stomach. And that's then where we find that lesser omentum to help hold the stomach kind of where it's supposed to be. All right, so these are the four peritoneal folds that we're going to talk about. But now we want to kind of zoom in on the alimentary canal and the accessory organs themselves. These are the two major divisions into which we can organize the digestive system. So the alimentary canal, alimentary meaning food, and canal is the pathway. So this is the pathway that the food is going to take to get from the oral cavity to the anal opening. Right? So if you think about the structures there, you're talking about the oral cavity, so your mouth, your pharynx, your larynx, your esophagus, and then from your esophagus down into your stomach, small intestine, large intestine. Some people include the larynx, some people don't, because the food is passing by it, okay, but shouldn't be entering right into that larynx, because the larynx is supposed to be protecting that airway and not allowing the food to be able to get down into the trachea. But if you imagine that pathway that the food is going to take, those are the structures along that alimentary canal. The accessory organs are all of the other components that may or may not come into contact with the food itself. So things like the salivary glands, right? The secretions from the salivary glands are very important, but the glands themselves, the food doesn't actually ever come into contact with the salivary glands. The secretions from the pancreas, super important for digestion. Secretions from the liver, very, very important for digestion, but the food doesn't actually ever come into contact with the liver or with the pancreas. And so those are going to be considered accessory organs, and we will talk about those as well. Now there's two major ways that we can look at the digestive system. We can talk about the alimentary canal, we can talk about all of the structures in the path that food is going to take, and we'll go from the oral cavity all the way down to the anal canal, and then we would come back and we could talk about those accessory organs separately. Or we can tell a story. Which one do you think we're going to do? Yeah, we're going to tell a story. So we're going to follow the food on its path from the oral cavity all the way through the digestive system. And whenever it runs into some of these secretions from these accessory organs, we're going to talk about it then. So we're going to see that a lot of these organs, like the pancreas and the liver, secrete into the duodenum, into the first portion of the small intestine. So once our food has arrived into the duodenum, into that proximal portion of the small intestine, we're going to pause on talking about the intestines, and we're going to talk about the liver, and we're going to talk about the pancreas and those secretions that the food runs into, and then we will carry on with our story of the food as it works its way through the rest of the small and the large intestine. So it may seem like we're kind of jumping back and forth between the canal and these accessory structures, but we're doing that on purpose, so that we're kind of imagining this from the viewpoint of the food that's traveling through, and what is it experiencing along the way. Are we going to see some videos from the different areas of the digestive system? Yes, we are. We've got some really fun ones from the esophagus going down this direction, some more fun ones from the large intestine going up the other direction, so we have some fun videos to see of that inside the stomach. So we'll get to that as we move along. In order to get to these fun videos of the esophagus and the stomach and the small and large intestine, we have to start, again, our journey through the oral cavity, through the mouth. This is where our nutrients are going to be entering in. Obviously, we do not want to have our cheese sandwich moving in through our nasal cavity because the lining of the nasal cavity is not designed to have food move through there. Right? What's the lining of the nasal cavity? Respiratory epithelium, which is? Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue with goblet cells, exactly right. That is not designed to have food move through it. It's the oral cavity and the mouth that is designed to be able to take in these nutrients. So this is probably the second worst drawing in the textbook. The worst one was from last semester, the connective tissues, where they were trying to show like all of the cells and then all of the fibers. It was terrible. Anyway, here, this is the second worst one because what the heck is this supposed to be? It's supposed to be the tongue. It's supposed to be the inferior surface of the tongue. So it's like when you lift up your tongue and look in the mirror and looking at the bottom of your tongue. That's what this is supposed to show you. It's like, whew, okay, well, this person needs to maybe do a little bit more practice in their drawings. But it's better than mine, so I can't argue too much. But the mouth itself is going to be formed obviously by the cheeks laterally and the hard and soft palate superiorly. Inferiorly, you're going to have the tongue take up most of the space there. There's some muscles associated with the mouth, as you would expect. The buccinator muscles in your cheeks, as well as the orbicularis oris muscles in your lips to be able to change the shape of your lips. And you think a lot of times, well, do I really change the shape of my lips? You're doing that all the time. Anytime you're speaking, you're going to be changing the shape of your lips to make the sounds that you want to make. And then you're looking at my lips right now, because you're thinking, oh yeah, is it? Are they moving? What's happening? Yeah, they're moving a lot. So you've got these orbicularis oris muscles there in your lips as well. And when you're eating, this is what's going to help make sure that your food and your drink stays in your mouth, and it's not just leaking out all over the place. You keep those muscles tightly closed to keep the contents of your mouth inside your mouth. Obviously, we know this is lined with our stratified squamous. Why is it going to be stratified squamous? Because, yes, what does this mean? Friction, exactly right. So the food that you're eating, right, think about all those hard crackers or the bagel that we just ate or whatever, there. It's all rubbing against this mucous membrane, and it's potentially going to be scraping away layers of those cells, and so we want to have multiple layers, so we have our stratified organization there for that. Okay, so this is the beginning of our journey through the digestive system, and then we can talk about the oral cavity itself and some of these anatomical features of the oral cavity. Obviously, we have the lips to be able to essentially form the boundary of what's the mouth and what's the inside of that oral cavity, what's the outside of the oral cavity. To hold the lips in place and make sure that there's going to be a little bit of structure to it, to kind of attach it to the jaw, we have the labial frenulum. Okay, so labial, we're talking about lip, and then frenulum is this ridge of tissue. So again, if you take your finger, you can open up your inferior lip or your superior, and you can see, show your classmate, whatever, with their consent, you can show them that labial frenulum that's attaching the lip onto the jaw. Or you can do this at home later in the mirror or what have you. There's a superior one up here as well, helping to anchor the lips on so that the lips aren't moving around too much, that they kind of stay within their range of motion. Then we have this terrible drawing of the tongue, but the reason why they've drawn it this way is to show you this inferior surface of the tongue, and specifically this lingual frenulum. So lingual, anytime you see lingual, you're talking about the tongue. And so this is another frenulum, which is this ridge of tissue that is going to help to limit the movement of the tongue itself. So your tongue, as we're going to see, has two different sets of muscles that will allow it to move in different ways. But we want to make sure that the tongue is not going to be exceeding its range of motion where then those muscles might become damaged. And so this lingual frenulum will limit how far you can stick out your tongue. Okay, so that's that ridge of tissue, and again, you can look in the mirror for your tongue upside down, you can see that ridge of tissue. That's going to limit the forward motion of the tongue, and it's going to limit the posterior motion of the tongue as well. So when people talk about swallowing their tongue, you can't actually swallow your tongue. Your tongue is going to be held in place, mostly, it allows movement inside your oral cavity, but you're not going to actually be able to swallow your tongue down into your esophagus. We're going to see that deglutition, which is the clinical term for swallowing, is when you're moving the contents of the oral cavity into your esophagus. Well, your tongue is not going to be able to move down into your esophagus because it's anchored in place in the oral cavity with this lingual frenulum. Now, can you choke on your tongue? Well, again, your tongue is not going to be able to move down into your trachea. You're not going to be able to block the opening, the tracheal itself, with the tongue. But can you block the pharynx with your tongue? Yeah, you can. So your tongue it does have the capacity to move posteriorly enough that you can actually block the trachea itself. Well, if you block, then you can block the pharynx. If you block the pharynx, are you stopping air movement?
Yeah.
Yeah, you are. So you can reduce the amount of airflow into your lungs if your tongue is then going to, if you go unconscious, for example, you're laying on your back and all of those muscles are relaxed, the tongue can flop to the posterior portion of the pharynx and block airflow. So that's possible. But it's not possible to swallow your tongue or have your tongue move down into your trachea. You just can't move that far because of this lingual frenulum. All right. So we've got our lingual frenulum on the inferior surface of the tongue there. If we look at the superior portion of the oral cavity, we've got the hard palate. So we've talked about the hard palate already. It forms the floor of your nasal cavity. Right? So because above this hard palate, you're going to have the nasal cavity. And you can feel this. If you take your tongue and push it against the roof of your mouth, well, you can feel this nice hard bone there. And if you work your way posterior, which we've done this little experiment already, you work your tongue posteriorly, eventually you reach a spot where the bone kind of drops off and it becomes soft tissue. Okay, that soft tissue there is actually called the soft palate. Okay, so we have our hard palate, the roof of the mouth, and then we have the soft palate, which is all this soft tissue posterior to the hard palate itself. And this is going to end then inferiorly at this little kind of dangly bit of tissue called the uvula. In cartoons, if you ever watch cartoons and there's a cartoon character that's yelling really loudly, and the camera zooms in really close on their mouth, and then what do you see in the cartoon? It's this big thing that's kind of like vibrating, and it's like vibrating. That's the uvula that they're talking about. Now we're going to see that the soft palate and the uvula are very important in making sure that during swallowing, during deglutition, food and drink is not going up into the nasal cavity. That's what's going to be pushing back against the posterior wall of the pharynx to make sure that the food is being directed in an inferior direction and not up into the nasopharynx or the nasal cavity. Make sure that when you're learning and remembering this name for this little floppy bit of tissue here, this uvula, that you get your U's and your V's in the right order. Because later on in the reproductive system, we're going to talk about another region or another set of structures called the vulva, which is the female external reproductive structures. V's and U's are there too. The vulva and the uvula are not the same thing. They're not part of the same area of the body. Everyone has a uvula. Some people have vulvas. Okay, so we have to make sure that we get our U's and our V's in the right order so that we know that we're talking about the right structures here. All right, then we finally have our fauces, and we've mentioned the fauces before. This is this imaginary boundary, this imaginary kind of line or plane that is then going to be the opening to the pharynx. Anything posterior to the fauces is then we're going to be considered to be in that oropharynx, and then on our way, hopefully, down towards the esophagus. All right, so this is our oral cavity. This then brings us to talking about the salivary glands. So the salivary glands are going to be very important structures to allow for the beginnings of digestion in the mouth. When we talk about salivary glands, we have three major pairs of salivary glands. We have the parotid glands, which is actually located, again, one on each side, located very, very superficially, so just deep to the skin. A lot of times we think, oh, there's big muscles here and your salivary glands are buried deep down. No, they're not. Salivary glands are very superficially located. If you remove the skin, then you will see these parotid glands between the masseter muscles. They sit on top of the masseter muscle and that skin, again on either side, just anterior and inferior to the ear. What type of glands are these salivary glands? How would we classify these glands? Exocrine glands, exactly right. We're secreting these secretions to the outside of the body or to a cavity that connects to the outside of the body. So all of the glands that we're going to be talking about along this pathway are all going to be considered exocrine because we're secreting to a space that is connected to the outside. Even when we talk about the pancreas later on, or the gallbladder, all these glands that are going to be secreting into the intestines or into the stomach, they are going to be considered exocrine because we're talking about secreting to that surface that connects to the outside of the body. The next set of salivary glands are the submandibular, so these sit beneath the base of the tongue, and also then beneath the base of the tongue, just superior to the submandibular, you have the sublingual. Okay, so again, these three pairs of salivary glands are going to be primarily responsible for producing the saliva that you're generating each day. Now, when we look at this salivary gland, here's an example of the parotid gland. I mentioned how superficially located it is. Look at how much tissue had to be removed to then expose that parotid gland. Not much, essentially just the skin, right? So you can see that the skin has been removed on this side of the face, and there's that parotid gland right there. So again, don't have to go very deep in order to be able to find those glands, or at least the parotid glands. All right, so let's take a look then at saliva. Yes, we said that there are those three pairs of salivary glands, but we also have many smaller glands. Sometimes there are only a few cells in size that are found in the mucosal lining of the oral cavity, and they will be able to produce saliva as well. Obviously, if there are only a few cells in size, then that gland is not going to be producing a large volume. So the vast majority of the volume of saliva that you're producing is anywhere from about 1 liter to 1.5 liters. And you think, well, how much is 1 liter to 1.5 liters? That's a lot, right? You're gonna wander over here kind of slowly and borrow your water bottle here for a second. Look at the size of this water bottle. Is this a liter? 300, yeah, it's a liter. 1 liter. Fill this up. That's spit. That's how much spit you're making every day, right? Over the course of the day, and sometimes even like another half as much again as that. So 1 liter, that's a ton of saliva that you're producing Obviously, if you're drinking a lot of water, then you're going to be producing more. If you're not taking in as much food, you'll produce less. So again, it all depends on how hydrated you're going to be. But the majority of that volume is going to be produced by our three pairs of glands that we talked about a minute ago. Now, obviously, you're not going to be producing all of this saliva and then spitting it out, or dribbling out the side of your mouth or anything like that. You're going to be swallowing most of it. Now, you're going to get back most of this volume. Again, a lot of it is going to be water. We're going to help to, yes, clean and moisten the mouth and the pharynx, but then we want to get those resources back. We don't want to just get rid of that water, so we are going to reabsorb that water into our bloodstream through the walls of our intestines. When we look at the composition of saliva, we find that it's mostly water. Most of the secretions that we generate in our body are mostly going to be water. In the case of saliva, it's about 99.5% water. Okay, so by far that's the biggest constituent, which is going to help us to dissolve our food and then facilitate our sense of taste, which we talked about last semester. So that means that only 0.5% of the volume of your saliva is then going to contain all the rest of these substances. So how much of these individual substances do you think there's going to be in your saliva? Are they going to be in pretty high concentrations? No. 0.5%, 0.5% of the volume, there's not going to be very much of this there at all, but it is going to be present in our saliva. A little bit of mucus, very watery mucus, very thin mucus, because of course there's not a lot of it around. Urea and uric acid. Where do we normally think about urea? Uric acid. In your urine, exactly. High concentrations of urea and uric acid in your urine. It's a waste product from muscle metabolism and protein metabolism. And so are you thinking, wait a minute, do I have urine in my saliva? Urinating in my... No, you're not. Right? But you have some of the same waste products in your saliva as you do in your urine. It's just that in your urine, it's in a much, much higher concentration. Antibodies, of course, are going to help to deal with bacteria. We also have lysozyme, an enzyme that's going to be acting as a bactericidal molecule to be able to reduce the numbers of bacteria in your oral cavity. Obviously, we're not going to be able to kill all of the bacteria in your mouth. There's tons and tons of bacteria that live there. But you know from Dr. Stewart's class, what are the ideal conditions for bacteria to grow? It needs to be warm, wet, and lots of resources, lots of stuff to eat. Well, that's your oral cavity. It's warm, it's wet, and there's tons of things to eat. So it's a perfect place for bacteria to grow. So what we're trying to do here is just kind of keep a lid on the growth, right? We're never going to get rid of all of the bacteria, but at least we can prevent them from taking over. And then we have two types of enzymes that are going to be here. Salivary amylase, which is going to help to break down starch, and then our lingual lipase, which begins the breakdown of fat in our mouth. And we'll talk a little bit more about this digestion in the oral cavity a little bit later on. The last thing we want to mention today is the regulation of salivation. So how is this going to be stimulated? Well, it's stimulated by the thought or the smell or the sound, memory of food. Before food even gets into your mouth, you can start salivating, right? And this is to make sure that your oral cavity is ready for when the food gets there. You don't really want to have a dry mouth when the food gets there. You want that lubrication to start right away. But if you do simply see a chip there laying on the floor and you say, great, you pick it up and put it in your mouth, haven't had time to think about it, haven't had time to smell it, anything like that, well then you can have that mechanical stimulation. The food rubbing on that mucous membrane will actually cause salivation to happen as well. And then on the other side of the coin, it's inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system, so we have that dry mouth when you're afraid or when you're having that anxiety. All right, so we'll stop there for today. We'll come back next week.